you, Mark, and good morning, everyone, and welcome. So, just to tell you a bit about myself, I am currently the CEO of East Africa Capital Partners and Cuba, and I'll be talking a bit about Cuba this morning. Previously, I started Swift Global in the mid-90s in Kenya and Uganda. Then, when the market opened up, 2001, I started Kenya Data Networks, and we started building data infrastructure. I then briefly, with my partner Mark Schneider, owned Africa Online and UUNet Africa. And then in 2008, we started financing Wananchi Group and Zuku. Along the way, I've been involved in a number of the institutions which are now key in the internet in East Africa. I was the founding chairman of TESPOC and the Kenyan Internet Exchange, and also the founding chairman of KenNIC, which manages Kenya's .ke domain name. I was also on the founding board of AfriNIC when we finally decided to get something done, and on the ICT board in Kenya when it was formed. And so the subject of data centers is particularly a passion of mine. The Kenyan Internet Exchange was, we had no idea when we set it up that it would be what it is today. And at the time I wrote a paper called The Halfway Proposition, which some of you will have read, which talked about how the world of the internet was unfair and the World Trade Organization should get involved. And in fact, as Bill Woodcock pointed out to me at the time, that wasn't the answer, but it was a way of getting something out there. And of course, the real answer is where we are today on infrastructure and what's going to be happening with data centers over the next couple of years. My partner at East Africa Capital Partners, Mark Schneider, whilst I was building infrastructure in Africa, he was building infrastructure in the rest of the world. He was the CEO of UPC and UIH. They built cable and internet infrastructure in 23 countries around the world before he sold out in 2005, and we hooked up together. We have another partner in Tanzania. Some of you may know Ali Mufaruki, very well-known Tanzanian who's very involved in East African integration and a well-known technology entrepreneur in Tanzania. And with this project, we have brought on board a chief operating officer from Terramark in the States. So we have a full team of people. And so we started, we've done a number of financings through 2008 up to the present day. And over that time, we raised over $400 million to put into infrastructure in East Africa, building a lot of fiber, building fiber to the home, the first triple play network on the continent. And our latest project, which has nothing to do with Wananchi, it's a completely new investment that we're doing, is Cuba. And Cuba, as we'll tell you a bit more about, is a carrier-neutral data center strategy for East Africa. I thought I'd start off by giving some statistics. I know there's a lot of technical people here, but the technical world has to interface with the financial world. And what's really been happening at the same time as infrastructure has been developing is the economies of the region have developed. And I'm sure a lot of you will be familiar with this map of how exciting Africa is. It's not about plague and pestilence, it's about economic growth these days. And the growth story was underpinned by Obama's visit recently to Kenya, where he wasn't there to preach aid, he was there to preach trade. And it was a very good visit and very good for the region. Some things that might surprise you. The Greater East Africa, and we always talk about East Africa, not any one country, because it's the region that's interesting economically. 390 million people in the region, that's a big market. It's one of the biggest markets in the world, actually by population, the third biggest market in the world, so it's huge. It's also growing at a phenomenal rate. 4 of the countries in East Africa will be growing faster than China over the next decade. So anybody who thinks that the growth isn't happening, the growth really is happening across the region. So the biggest thing that's happened since I started building infrastructure is the emergence of the undersea cables. And talking to some people last night, I thought some of you might be interested to see some of the inside story on what happened at Teams.
Kenyans used to call at 60 shillings per minute on the mobile phone and $6 to make a call to UK or to US. So it was very expensive, and I knew if we had the link, we could lower the cost of calling and actually bring in more people to afford telephony in this country.
Everybody in Kenya, Uganda and Tanzania and a bit of our neighbors were using satellite connectivity to get to the internet. And that internet access via satellite was, one, very expensive, and two, it had a lot of latency.
Where there is one cable, and there was one cable in West Africa for many years called SAT3, the pricing of cable capacity sat just below satellite capacity. So satellite capacity was sitting at $3,000 a megabit, and cable capacity sat at $2,000 something a megabit for literally a decade. So the question then is, how do you fix the problem?
We had an initiative before teams called EASY. They had been meeting for 5 years, and it was very difficult to manage because some countries would attend but they didn't have the resources to invest in it. It was apparent that it was not going to work.
So it was at that point that we started wondering and thinking to ourselves, now that EASY does not look like it's coming in a hurry, what are we going to do? We started exploring the possibility of building a cable for East Africa.
For us, it was very difficult to raise like 80 billion to invest in it. We consulted with various operators if they could invest in it, getting practically all the operators in the country.
The business model that we developed was where we were going to forward finance, and then later on to offload it to the private sector.
And so it worked because all of the competitors were part of the team's cable. And what we agreed on as a financial structure for the cable was that instead of getting a financial return out of your investment in the cable, what you got was a share of the capacity on the cable.
It was a very unique model which nobody had ever attempted to do.
To this day, it's working beautifully, it's working very well. What happened, of course, is following the success of teams, other fiber optic cables were built. The fact that we involved the private sector, the users of the fiber, is one of the factors that made it a success.
What we need to learn from teams is not just the capacity, the broadband capacity, but a model that can now be replicated in other sectors where you have players competing but have invested in the same infrastructure.
It's very important for the ICT industry in Kenya to be able to have access to good capacity and at a good price. We are now interconnected with Google in Nairobi and Mombasa. We are also connected with Google in London. We've partnered with Akamai to localize the traffic from the Akamai network.
We're moving from an area where physical positioning in the world is no longer relevant. And I think governments all around the world are starting to recognize very, very critically that technology is the biggest single enabler that they have in order to grow their own world economy.
And so the undersea cables got built. Seacom got built on the back of the World Cup in South Africa. Teams got built on the back of support from the Kenyan government. And EASY got built about a year later. And so we went from no cables to 3 cables, and actually in competition economic terms, 10 cables, because Teams acts actually like 7 separate cables in terms of pricing, not one. So a lot of capacity. And at the same time, the infrastructure has been being built, and there's a huge amount of terrestrial fiber in the region, and operators have been building out the infrastructure to service that. Liquid Telecom, Safaricom, all the mobile operators moving to 4G and 3G, and that infrastructure means that the final mile, the players who are building it or have built it are in place and financed. Let's look at what Wenanchi Group has been doing in terms of building that infrastructure in East Africa.
Wenanchi Group's a pretty unique business with a varied portfolio of underlying businesses. We're a business services business operating under the brands Simbanet, Aldine, iSat and Wenanchi Telecom. We're a retail business in the DTH and cable world offering the brand Zuku. We operate and offer affordable entertainment for the growing middle class in East Africa.
When my partners and I envisioned Wenanchi Group, we realized that the consumers here wanted the same products as people want anywhere else in the world.
They really were a company that was looking to do something that had never been done before in Africa, to build the first pay television and internet service provider lumped up into one.
We operate and build our own fiber optic cable network direct to the home, at the moment in Nairobi and coming soon in Mombasa, Dar es Salaam and Kampala.
So technologically wise, our customers in Kenya are similar to those in advanced countries, whereby they have one cable for which they are getting their data, voice and video. Our customers now can enjoy a full triple play service with voice, video and data.
A bit like some of the major European and North American companies have been doing, except that we're using the most modern technology, which means that we're actually one step ahead of the game here in East Africa. Zuku is actually two businesses in one. It's a DTH business operating satellite television in East Africa. We're actually operating today in 3 countries, Kenya, Uganda and Tanzania.
We are now planning launches in other countries, and based on the satellite that we are on, the SES-5 satellite, we have opportunity to be in 33 African countries. So the future for us is bright. We need to grow into those markets for our DTH customers.
I see a growing continent with a middle class that's developing. I see a demand for entertainment and communication that is similar to what I've observed in the 80s and the early 90s in the rest of the world.
Africa, and within it particularly East Africa, is seen as a growth market, almost untapped in terms of pay TV. So in the light of this, it was decided to set up a programming group in Nairobi and be able to create channels that would be ours, that we could brand as Zuku channels. We now manage and operate 9 Zuku branded channels, and over the next couple of years that is bound to grow to a couple more.
Having started this, and we have a head start on other competitors, I think we're going to be able to take advantage of our being East African or being at the center of the Swahili world.
East Africa is also starting to really blossom in terms of some of the content that's coming out of here. And so what you have is it's Africa through the lens of Africans.
People like Zuku, who are commissioning, licensing young entrepreneurs, young creators to be able to produce original quality content.
That ability to actually generate relationships, start generating conversations with content creators, I think is putting Zuku in a different league altogether.
We're a big employer, we're a big investor, and we believe that we're operating and offer a huge amount of opportunity for people to actually produce for us content, to help us in terms of our capital investment, and to help us in terms of operating our business.
Wenanchi has the potential today of becoming a really substantial and significant part of the rollout of broadband and entertainment in Africa.
And so what's been happening is, on the back of all this infrastructure getting built, this image, which is one of the most overused images on the continent, has actually changed to this. It's now about content. And I'll just give you a quick flavor of some of the content that's now being produced in East Africa and is finding its way onto the internet.
I'm Kieran Jethro, a chef and restaurateur in Kenya. Contrary to popular belief, Africa has rich and vibrant food. My mission, to place this continent on the culinary map. Africa is my bushland.
Hello and welcome. This is Afrofuse. The music starts right now.
Ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together and show some love for the one, the only,
I'm coming down with the sound. I really like the groove. I hear the beat play and my feet just wanna
DJ Hypnotic.
What it do, what it does, it's your boy Mr. D to the N to the G. Top shot and damn ya nyumba.
Zanzibar, Tanzania to Uganda.
Humanity's desire to relate to the supernatural and shape spirituality has defined mankind and its behavior ever since human beings developed a conscience.
You're just in time for this week's episode of Setting the Pace.
Philip Wamaya will finish with a flourish and scores.
This week on fire is on fire.
The youth and the people that ran away from bullets, they won't come back. They won't invest their time back in our country.
There are two things that I would like to discuss today.
Same time,
same place,
7:30 p.m.
Zuku Sport
on Thursdays.
And so the time for content has arrived, and the opportunities are now to build the infrastructure in the form of data centers to house a lot of this content. Subscriber growth has been growing, mobile broadband has been growing. Across the whole market, the uptake of bandwidth has been growing exponentially as people start to use more and more content over the internet and through streaming. We did some benchmarking of South America, and so these are some more internet statistics. I'll let you have a lot of these statistics, which you may not have after the presentation. We did some benchmarking of South America in terms of development of bandwidth and opportunities for data centers, and they validate the fact that now is the time for data centers to start emerging as carrier-neutral facilities on this continent. Now, one of the statistics that I can share with you, which you may not realize, I pulled these off Zuku. We're no longer involved with the Mnanchi Group anymore. I showed you those film clips because I wanted to give you some impression of the infrastructure that's going to be supporting the rollout of data centers and, as a result, connectivity. But these are Zuku statistics. So Zuku today, on its fiber network, is doing nearly 400 kilobits per subscriber across the network. If you benchmark that against Europe, Numericable or Virgin are doing about 550 per subscriber currently, and Wenanchi's projections are that by the end of next year they'll be pulling as much bandwidth as European operators are. So there's a huge amount of consumption of bandwidth where the fiber is available, and that's important because data centers need content providers, and content providers need to be sure the content is being used. What's possibly more interesting for those of you that follow the market is that with fiber, it takes time to build the fiber to the home. So a lot of the infrastructure today is wireless infrastructure, people moving to 4G all over the region. And this was some information we pulled out comparing the types of content being used across the mobile networks in Africa versus other continents of the world. And what it shows you is that the blue and the grey bars, which you'll see represent 60 to 70% of the traffic in other continents, that's social networking and real-time content. the sort of thing that I was showing you just now in terms of video streaming. And yet in Africa today, the utilization there is much lower for those types of content. And that's against an environment where we already know that the consumer wants this sort of content. So the conclusion is that there's a supply side problem. The content is not localized, and because the content is not localized, mobile operators are reluctant to open the pipe because that variable cost of international bandwidth becomes a significant portion of their costs. If that operator is operating on ARPUs of $10, $15, $5 of bandwidth costs per subscriber going up to 8 or 10 can kill a business. So there's a supply side problem which is causing mobile operators to control bandwidth. As the content localizes as data centers become available, so they will be less reluctant to open up those pipes, and the bandwidth profile of the consumers will move towards where it is in the rest of the world. So what are we doing? We're building a data center, and as I say, we've moved our focus away from we are now raised capital for Cuba. We've invested an initial $25 million in the first facilities for Cuba. That first facility will be in Mombasa, on Mombasa Island, just next to Fort Jesus. It's 100 meters away from the Seacom landing station and about 300 meters away from the Teams and Easy landing station. We've made sure that we have discussions with the cable operators, so we'll have direct fiber cross connects from the facility into the undersea cables. We've organized with the power company to overcome the power problem, and the power problem is often misunderstood. What people don't realize is that East Africa has gone from a power generation deficit to a power generation surplus. Today, both Kenya, Uganda, Ethiopia and Tanzania are producing more power than they need. And the long distance distribution network is very solid and is becoming a regional power pool as we speak. The real problem has been on the 11 kV distribution lines, which are overused, under-specced. And so what we're doing in Mombasa, we're actually pulling in two separate 33 kilovolt lines of our own and putting in two substations of our own on the facility premises to overcome that problem. And we're then stabilizing that power with voltage stabilizers to make sure that any fluctuations don't affect the system. That's the layout. The initial phase in Mombasa will have 500 square meters of white space, 2 megawatts of power provisioned, and that will grow in two additional phases, so the whole facility will eventually be 1,500 square meters, 750 racks, 6 megawatts of power. That facility will be broken ground on next month, and it will be fully operational Q1 next year. And for those of you who like the technical side of it, we have an offer from a carrier who is going to be provisioning 10 gigabit ports between the Mombasa exchange and the Nairobi exchanges for under $1,000 a month. So in order for people to connect, there's no bottleneck between Mombasa and Nairobi anymore. We're expecting two other carriers to follow suit on that. As I mentioned, the first phase of 500 square meters, 5.4 meter height to the room, so meets international specifications, 1 meter high raised floor, and everything is fully redundant and compliant. All the usual suspects will be providing equipment for the facility to international standards, and the idea is then to broaden that out. We're christening it the Silicon Corridor. As some of you may know, Tanzania is actually still something of a problem because the backbone is currently closed or not as open as it should be. But from Mombasa to Nairobi to Kampala to Kigali, there's lots of dark fiber, and carriers are now saying, let's open up those pipes to give people real high bandwidth connectivity. So we see that corridor from the coast up into the center of Africa opening up very fast, and then eventually, hopefully after the elections, Tanzania will start opening up as well, and will then start opening things to the south. We will be building a second facility outside Nairobi, a large campus facility, and we'll have a small interconnect facility in the middle of town as well. And that's the roadmap for what we're doing, and we expect to be delivering services to many of the people in this room in the not too distant future. And with that, I thank you for listening, and I hope we've given you some feel for what we're planning to do on carrier-neutral data centers in East Africa over the next 18 months to 2 years. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. I think at this stage I'd like to actually immediately open up the floor for questions, because I believe there should be some interest and some queries to Richard in this regard. I think maybe from my side, if I can just start, there's traditionally been a long push, within Africa to say the reason there's no growth in content, which is obviously not driving the growth in traffic and so forth, is because there's not enough local content being built. There was a discussion on the AFPIF mailing list, I think a week or two ago, where I posited that is the issue that we lack local content, or is the issue that we lack the relevant or the popular content in Africa? Is building local content the panacea, or is actually localizing the popular content, the relevant content, whatever it might be, the usual suspects in Africa, the solution, which obviously drives the data center angle of it? Should we be focusing more on building content that is more in tune with our environment, or should we be focusing on getting the popular content into Africa to change that ratio of traffic flow, or should we be doing both?
So it's a good question, and we've been exposed to this quite a lot developing content when I was at Zuku, and it's the perennial problem. One of the clips you saw was for Africa Tales of the Bush Larder, which was a cooking show that we produced. That show was deliberately produced to international standards. 6 months after we aired the Series 1, Fox International came in and bought the international rights for Series 1 and wanted to co-invest into Series 2. They launched in 32 countries around the world. And within 12 months of launching that show became an incredibly profitable show. That's the way content can develop if the vision is big enough. The challenge with content has always been, how do you make it pay? And that challenge is still there because there's not enough revenue coming in. The advertising market is too small currently. The broadcasting market is expanding with more and more channels, but the same amount of advertising revenue. So the revenue model is key, and we think it's beginning to break open. What we see is that the lead in content has to be government. In Kenya, government still represents 40% of the economy. They deliver by far the largest number of services to citizens of anybody, and what we have is this unique situation where not only has the government bought into using the internet to deliver services more efficiently at lower costs to citizens, and that lower cost is very important to them. It's also driving out corruption, so you don't have to pay these informal networks of fixers to get things anymore because service is available on the internet, and that's coincided with the consumer who's discovered this thing, and particularly with M-Pesa and mobile money transfers. I could not do without my phone. I pay salaries from my phone. If I haven't got enough money in my phone to pay the salaries, I go to my phone and I transfer money from my bank account to my phone, and I then pay the salaries. In Nairobi today, when you go to park in the middle of Nairobi, you don't have parking attendants anymore. You go to your phone, you dial *217#, and you pay the city council 300 shillings from your phone, and you tell them by phone that your registration number is KBL 203S, and their inspectors then go around with a phone looking at cars to check whether that car has paid for its daily parking in the middle of Nairobi. And so that sort of growth of content from government is, we believe, what's going to stimulate the first wave of content growth in the region, because there are so many services that they can do. That parking's at the one end of the extreme. At the other end, the Ministry of Health in Kenya is putting in health centres around the country where you can have an X-ray or a audiogram taken in a remote area of the country. It will then be fed electronically into a centralized database in Nairobi, where a consultant can look at the pictures, determine what the problem is, and send that information back to the doctors in the rural areas. So across the entire spectrum, government is going to be one of the biggest drivers. And that will give time for the revenue streams from pay TV or advertising or other direct selling of merchandising to start picking up. So it'll be an evolution, starting with government and then the private sector driving it up.
Yeah, okay, so that solves the local needs. Like, I need to park my car over here in Nairobi, that makes sense. I need to pay my customers, I need to pay my employees with M-Pesa, that makes sense. That's local, that's fine. That still doesn't account for the fact that 90% on average of all traffic hitting the networks in Africa is coming from outside Africa. So do we think we can convert that 90% traffic into 90% local by building equivalent applications in Africa, i.e. an African Facebook, an African LinkedIn? Is that feasible? Or do we really need to start thinking about more practical solutions, such as why don't we get LinkedIn and Facebook and so forth into Africa if that is what the people want?
It's a combination of both of the above. For sure, the international content needs to localize if it wants to become relevant. But that hasn't stopped local companies starting to compete in that space. If you look at what Angani is doing with cloud services and building up local cloud services in competition with the international content, but the international guys haven't come yet, right? Amazon hasn't localized, so there's room for local entrepreneurs to be building these businesses. Jumia is another one, building online shopping, and because the payment systems are there, those platforms are beginning to get traction and will continue to grow. So we see it as a combination of things that are going to happen. The one thing I'm not a believer in at all is this idea of a sort of pre-planned approach to content, that we must do this or we must do that. The market will decide what needs to be done. And I think it's changing already. I would hazard a guess that over the next 18 months you will see pretty dramatic changes in the nature of the traffic patterns coming out of the region.
So Kuba built a data center in Mombasa. This is great. Obviously, it spurs other data centers to come up in Mombasa, in Tanzania, in Maputo, and so forth. That's great. So that obviously means that now the global content providers see a viable reason to invest further into Africa, because I think obviously one of the biggest issues they've had is capacity pricing and the lack of co-location. So let's say those issues are now fixed. What incentive now does that give the local content growth, seeing as now the Amazons of the world are now in country, providing their services locally at good latency, hopefully good price and good performance? How does that spur on the African content development to compete with what Amazon and Microsoft and Google and so forth are now doing? Both obviously to play in that space, but also to increase the penetration with more useful, with more direct content that makes sense for Africans.
If you look at the companies, the East African companies that have been exponentially successful in the region, companies like Safaricom, Equity Bank, their success has been based not on copying what else happens in the rest of the world. Their success has been based on adapting something from the rest of the world to make it really relevant to the local market. Actually, when Equity Bank took off in Kenya, and Equity Bank are now, they took off in 2004. they were almost non-existent. Today, they're the largest bank in East Africa. They service 6 million households, which means in terms of people serviced, they probably serve as many as Safaricom does. And they achieved that success by opening bank branches at the same time as Barclays Bank and Standard Chartered Bank were closing bank branches in Kenya. And so they adapted to the needs of the local community. If you look at, again, I take the example of Angani, which I think is a phenomenally successful startup, doing phenomenal stuff. They're targeting the SMEs with relevant services to those SMEs within the market. And so whilst they will definitely see competition from the big international players as they come on, it's very hard for those international companies to really adapt and adopt to the real needs of the local market, because they just don't understand it. They come to Nairobi and they sit in Westlands and they go to the Sankara Hotel and they think that's Kenya. Well, that's not Kenya. Kenya is all the rest of the country where income levels are much lower, the needs are very different, and that's where the competitive advantage is for local entrepreneurs, is to really understand what the market wants rather than being blinded by what they've seen elsewhere in the world, because they understand the market.
Question? Yes, please.
Merci. J'aimerais dire merci au conférencier pour son brillante intervention. On a eu beaucoup de couleurs, beaucoup de vidéos, mais je remarque que tout son plan est en Afrique de l'Est. C'est bien de penser à l'Afrique de l'Est, mais l'Afrique, il y a aussi d'autres parties, surtout l'Afrique de l'Ouest, d'où je viens, de la Côte d'Ivoire. Est-ce qu'il y a un plan pour nous aussi? Et quand est-ce qu'ils vont déployer un plan pour la Côte d'Ivoire, pour l'Afrique de l'Ouest en général? Moi, je me dis que le continent est vaste et nous attendons aussi qu'ils viennent pour nous aider, je crois. Merci.
Did you get that? No. So the lady is asking, when will these initiatives, such as the ones you speak of today, come to West Africa? Considering that a lot of this is happening in East Africa and Southern Africa, and obviously there's a lot more attention that's required in West Africa as well.
Well, I think it's already happening. I know of a number of companies which are doing similar sort of things in West Africa. You'll see that our investment partnership is called East Africa Capital Partners, and that's for good reason. We think we understand East Africa. We know very little about South Africa and virtually nothing about West Africa. And so I personally won't be rushing over there in a hurry because I just don't understand the market. We understand East Africa. But from what I've heard, there are a number of things happening over there. The key is always the dynamics of the market. We've been very fortunate in East Africa by having multiple undersea cables with good competition, multiple terrestrial cables with good competition, and multiple final mile operators who are well financed and able to build out the local loop, and plenty of competition. So that's been driving prices down. When we look at Tanzania, Tanzania has been somewhat less successful because they did the opposite of what Kenya did. In Kenya, the power and lighting company, for example, went for a dark fiber model from Mombasa to Nairobi to the Uganda border. That means that multiple operators can each buy their own dark fiber, light it with as much capacity as they like, and open up those pipes. In Tanzania, the government got a loan from the Chinese government to build a massive national backbone in Tanzania. The imperative from the Chinese was to sell more Chinese equipment, so they made it a lit network. And then they gave it to a government department to manage. Well, that government department doesn't even have a pricing for a 10 gigabit port on the network. It's barely got 1 gigabit at the transit points on the borders. In fact, I don't even think it offers Ethernet service. I think it's still SDH, and I think the biggest link they have between Kenya and Tanzania is an STM16 at the Arusha border. So that's kept the whole of Tanzania closed, and that's very unfortunate because Tanzania has more countries as its neighbor than any other country in Africa. There are 8 countries that border Tanzania, and so potentially it could be a hub for the whole region, aggregating traffic from all of those countries into Tanzania. But if you talk to any of the content people here, talk to Google or Cloudflare, they'll tell you that the traffic coming out of Tanzania is really very small, and yet it's the same size economy as Kenya, it's slightly more people than Kenya, and it has more regional reach than Kenya, and yet the traffic is still very small, and it's largely because of this rigidity in the market. So I know there's been some of that rigidity in West Africa, and the key is to overcome those barriers and have a very open model.
Any other question? Perhaps maybe somebody from West Africa is willing to comment. There was somebody from Main 1, I think, who might know a little bit more. Or yeah, sure, please.
Armand, je suis de la Côte d'Ivoire. Ce que je voudrais ajouter, il a parlé de câbles sous-marins. Particulièrement en Côte d'Ivoire, nous avons 3 opérateurs de câbles sous-marins. On a le WAX qui est déployé par MTN. On a ACE déployé par Orange Côte d'Ivoire. Et on a le SAT3 qui est dirigé par Orange Côte d'Ivoire aussi. Pour dire que le marché plus ou moins porteur, nous sommes en train de nous battre afin que le réseau ivoirien soit à la hauteur des autres pays de l'Afrique. Donc nous pouvons vous encourager à venir dans notre pays. Merci.
Thank you. Baby steps. There was a question here first, and then I'll come to you just now.
Okay. This is Matthew Chigwende from Liquid Telecom. My question is with regard to, I would say, intellectual property laws. We have seen that in terms of content. I just want to see your opinion on this. We have seen a lot of pirated videos and all, and music. How does this, in your opinion, affect growth of content on the network in terms of people putting their stuff on, content like video content on online?
Yeah, I think it's an extremely good point and a very, very important one. We were heavily involved in this when I was at Wenanchi, and there's actually 2 problems. One problem is the intellectual property laws are not strong enough. There are provisions, but there's no mechanism for enforcing those provisions, and so the matter gets stuck between different regulatory bodies. Nobody's prepared to take action, and there's still a huge amount of piracy in the region, and that is very much holding back content development, and it's one of the areas which regulators and policymakers really should look into. The second area, which is problematic, is when we talk about some of the problems on infrastructure competition. What we've seen is that if you have one operator, it's a monopoly. If you have 2 operators, it's a duopoly. But if you have 3 operators, it's an oligopoly, right? And the textbook really does tell you the answer. Oligopolies tacitly collude with each other. So if you have 3 or 4 players and they start colluding, not through contractual collusion, but tacit collusion in the market, then prices will have come down from a duopoly situation, but they still won't be fully competitive. It's not until you have 5 or 6 players that you get a fully competitive outcome. And so in the content space, the continent has been really plagued by monopoly behavior from DSTV and MultiChoice in South Africa. They've tied up huge amounts of content in monopoly contracts, and we spent some time trying to fight those with the company, as I understand it, is still trying to fight those. But but the regulators aren't helping them. And so if you have a monopoly content aggregator, then it's very hard for the market to grow, particularly the local market, because that operator is calling the shots. There's only one place to sell your content, and they dictate the price. And they then lock people in for long periods of time, and it's stopping competition. So the competition economics, as well as the intellectual property rights for content, are key. And I'm sorry to say that it's one of the areas which certainly in East Africa has really had very, very little attention from the regulators. Every time a competition case comes along, it goes through endless evolutions of politics. And one minute the regulator says they're going to do something about it, and the next minute they don't. And it's a big problem. You make a very good point.
I mean, let's not beat about the bush. You're talking about soccer, right? So, obviously DSTV has a monopoly because they made the deal with the soccer clubs, and that's fine. Assuming that goes away, is Africa ready to make those contractual obligations to the studios and the content rights holders to get the eyeballs from Africa?
Yeah, but see, the problem with content is premium content becomes becomes must-have content, and so if it gets locked up, then you're limiting the eyeballs that it can go to, and then you're limiting competition. When Anchi went out and took on the basketball league in Kenya, they went in with a sponsorship package which was actually higher than the sponsorship package for the football 2 years prior to that. So much less popular sport. We paid more than they had been paying 2 years before, and within literally 6 months of us sponsoring the university's basketball league, Star Times came along and started sponsoring a national basketball league, and 9 months after that, Supersport started sponsoring another league, and so the sponsorship in that sport went up dramatically because there was competition, whereas in other sports it's just not there, and it's up to the regulator to solve the problem. In other markets this has been dealt with. So content in the UK, for example, you can watch Sky Sports on Sky, or you can watch Sky Sports on digital terrestrial, or you can watch Sky Sports on Virgin Media on cable. It's available on all those platforms, and it's only available on all the platforms because the regulator has turned around to Sky and said you cannot sit on must-have content and keep it just for your network, because otherwise there's never going to be real competition. And you can see it in, it can start. It is entirely possible it's going to start happening in the internet space when you have companies which are very dominant with a mass market. Like there are in some countries in East Africa. If the regulator doesn't deal with it, it becomes a problem.
Fiona, you had a question.
All right, my name is Benga Kong, Minwan, Nigeria. Just for the question the lady asked earlier, Minwan also is operating a data center service currently. We built a data center, tier 3 data center in Nigeria. And there's also plan to have another data center around Nigeria and also expand to Ghana, from where we can service West Africa as a whole. Currently, we provide services to Côte d'Ivoire, and I think for data center we can do likewise. But my question goes to Koba. I would like to know, you said the data center facility in Mombasa will be launched next month?
No, Q1.
Q1 next year.
Yeah.
But do you currently operate any data center facility aside this? And I also want to know, in terms of the build versus buy dynamics, what are the build versus buy dynamics in East Africa that you think will drive data center services adoption and will make it more appreciated to move infrastructures into data centers as regards enterprises building their own small facility to house their servers?
Well, I mean, the dynamics are the same as everywhere else in the world. You know, if you can build a reasonable scale facility, and we think the smallest that is a sensible scale is 2 megawatts, then you can provide much more competitive services than people who are investing in their own infrastructure and putting in their own facilities. Sort of doesn't make sense anymore, which is what they've seen everywhere else in the world. So long as the facility is carrier neutral and the interconnectivity is there.
To the gentleman from Main One again, you said Main One are building data centers in West Africa. Obviously, Main One are a carrier, but are the operations of the data centers carrier neutral?
Yes, the operation so the data center service we have now is for a separate company called MDXI. They're owned by Main One and is a carrier neutral data center. So we have all carriers come to the data center and provide interconnection services.
Okay, that's good. I think another question to you from my side, Richard, is on data caps.
On?
Data caps. Data caps have become a way of life for Africa, well, for pretty much any mobile customer around the world, but especially for us. And they've now seemed to extend it into the fixed line services as well. You buy fiber in some places and you get a myriad of options on data caps. One could make the case for data caps on mobile networks. Maybe 5 years ago, I don't know about today, but okay, we'll give them that. On wireline services. Customers have come to expect data caps to be the natural way of things. And obviously that means that they don't invest as much time and effort in being online to do the things they want because they need to have the data run for the entire month. Are these data caps a real issue, a real impediment to the growth of take-up?
I think data caps on wireline service are a complete nonsense. And I don't think in East Africa we've seen too much of that happening. Zuku's network doesn't have data caps. Liquid's network doesn't have data caps. Putting data caps on wireline is a complete nonsense. Now, on wireless, I think we're going to see the data caps decrease over time. There are basically two bottlenecks on wireless, which is why the data caps are there. One is frequencies. Now, historically, 3G frequencies were relatively scarce. As the digital migration comes to a conclusion and regulators are able to free up the rest of the frequencies which are coming out of the digital dividend and give those to 4G and LTE operators, there will be less and less of an imperative for them to constrain demand on the wireless services. And we're already seeing that in Kenya. Safaricom recently set their data cap on one of the services at 20 gigabits, I think. And that's quite a lot of traffic. Now the problem is, from the perception of the consumer point of view, he still knows he has a data cap, and so he's reluctant to do what he would do on a wireline service. But that's changing very quickly. And what will, as well as the frequencies becoming available, what will also help in that change is, as the content starts localizing, then the component of the revenue which goes to direct bandwidth costs will become less significant because the content is localizing, and that's what we want to see in out of data centers is as all that content localizes, it becomes much more efficient, and the operators are happy to open up the pipe. So I think we will see it going in the other direction. I know there's historically been caps on wireless, but I don't think they're going to be there forever.
But aren't the wireless caps more a phenomenon of radio rollout as opposed to international capacity? Or
no, it's a phenomenon of, see, if you have a movement, if you look at those numbers that Zuku did on fiber, it's 0.5 megabit per subscriber, right? And so if that 0.5 megabit is costing, $2, $3, $4 on a $10 ARPU, that becomes a really significant problem for the operator in terms of return on investment. The wireline ARPUs are much higher. They're in the sort of $30, $40 range, and so, which is why it doesn't matter for wireline operators so much. But it's some component of the international capacity costs, and it's the frequencies. It's not so much a factor of the towers, because the new frequencies that are coming from the digital dividend actually have very good propagation characteristics. It's a factor of how much frequency is available, which then either congests or not their network as you open up the pipe.
Yes, I saw a hand there.
Yeah, it's Eckert from New Telco. Richard, we've provided a number of storage solutions to a couple of African content generators, let me call them, in SADC countries. I found that they generally seem to have a bit of a trust issue with regards to putting their content into third-party data centers, which I guess is understandable because it's their bread and butter. And they need to make sure that it's properly secured and managed. I'm not sure whether you're finding something similar in your markets.
Less and less so. I think the market, there are some people who still feel that way, but the rack huggers are getting less and less. The mentality is very much changing to saying, you know what, if third-party data centers work everywhere else in the world, and it's not with a carrier, then why wouldn't we use it? So in the same ways as we leapfrogged in East Africa with mobile payments, attitudes from CIOs are really fairly sophisticated and advanced in the region.
Yes.
This is Meoli from Keynote in Kenya. If I understand the basis for starting off a data center, a 2 megawatt data center, which is fairly large for us in East Africa. You make the assumption that we are ready for content. And I ask the question, do you think there is a case in which that we need to have a lot more initiatives to generate more demand for data center services like you are doing in Zuku, creating content, or what the government is doing? Do you think there is space for us as a community to encourage more data? Because it appears that your business model is really not based on other people bringing in their content from outside to host it, but rather the East Africans themselves creating the need to go into a data center.
You know, the challenge with initiatives around content is that there's always this huge danger of doing content for the sake of content without there really being a demand for that content. And you know, the initiators of those sort of programs are generally not that adept at understanding what the market wants in terms of content. It's the consumer is really tricky, right? The consumer generally doesn't do as he's told. He does exactly what he wants to do, and so as I said earlier, the biggest imperative is government, and included in that things like yourselves on educational networks, where you know, the curriculum for schools and universities is the curriculum, and therefore you know, they'll have the content whether they like it or not, because that's the curriculum which gets you through exams. So that's a fairly straightforward one to start pushing out there. Likewise, government services. If I can pay my parking online and I can get my driving license online, it costs the government less, and I've got to get a driving license anyway, and I've got to get a business license, and I've got to pay my taxes. I paid my income tax this year with M-Pesa. It's pretty cool, isn't it? So it's those sort of services where there can be a real imperative, but once you get beyond that, it's tough to have programs to say, you know, this content is the one that the consumer must have, because the consumer has a mind of his own.
I think. Okay, sure.
My name is Fiona Songa, CEO of the Kenya Internet Exchange Point. Just to add on to, I think, what Koba is doing, from where we sit, we've had a lot of challenges in terms of being able to match up with other exchange points in other parts of the world in terms of getting Kenyan content hosted abroad to be hosted back in Kenya. And I think that when we look at the amount of, when we say 90% of traffic is going out, but the amount of that traffic that is also local content hosted outside the region is quite substantial. Case in point, with the directives from the Ministry of ICT in Kenya that require the broadcasting houses to have a significant amount of their content on air as local content, and it's all digital, but it's all hosted out of the country. And we've been talking to them to try and bring these locally and even share it over the Exchange Point platform. I think there's a very strong business case for data centers locally, especially within the Kenyan space that I understand very well. And we are looking forward to seeing the data centers coming up in our space, because as the Exchange Point, we have spoken to the broadcasting houses, and they are looking for space to host their content. Their broadcasting content is quite substantial. If you have a look at what they need in terms of being able to air and customer demands of content, video on demand, then there is quite a need for substantial hosting space to be able to serve the local customer. So I think eventually the 90% is substantially going to go down, but we need to be able to really push and work on it. And to just sum it all, I think what COBA is doing is a good initiative. Yeah, thank you.
Great, thank you. You know, just I'm not a big fan of having governments start trying to force issues, because sometimes it works. More often than not, it creates perverse incentives. If you look at take Kennick as an example. When we started the .ke registry, I think there were 1,000 or 900 KE domains, and people in the local market would all say, we want a .com domain because we're big and important. Today, Kenyan companies don't use .com domains, they use .ke domains. That change came about because the quality of service that Kennick were offering, the support, being able to pay a local registry, use a local registry, pay online, and so it was a market-driven change. And so things like content hosted outside, I would like to believe that companies like Angani, who are coming up with local cloud services so that local developers can host websites locally to the same quality and standards and less expensively than going overseas, and able to make a local phone call for technical support and pay for their website with M-Pesa and integrate local solutions into the website. That needs to be a market-driven process, not a government or sort of dictate.
I had a question over there.
Yeah, Ben Roberts, Liquid Telecom. Richard, and while we're talking about government, thankfully our government in Kenya allows people like us to build data centers, but we've seen other governments in Africa and East Africa as well building their own data centers, and I've even heard of one government in our region instructing operators not to build data centers because they were going to build one. So I guess the question is, what is the role of government in constructing and building and operating data centers?
Yeah, well, you and I have faced some of these problems frequently. Government should not be in the business of doing business. Government should not build infrastructure. And if you look at the projects that have been successful in the region, it's ones where government have helped the private sector to build infrastructure. And if you look at the projects that have failed, it's where government have decided to build infrastructure themselves and then try and do something with it. Government just should not be in the business of building infrastructure. What was unique about Teams was that it was the only project that I have seen of its nature where government did what government should do. If you look at it from a financial perspective, what actually happened with Teams? The ministry said, we want to build an undersea cable. They got Ernst & Young to do a proposal. The Ernst & Young proposal looked like a proposal for Sat3, right? It was a disaster. The government then consulted us. Bitangi and Demo came and said, well, what do you guys think? And we said, we don't want that. We want a shared infrastructure where we're not going to have to go through a gatekeeper. Bitangi said, okay, we'll do that. The government then went out and funded the undersea survey. The government went out and started the whole process for tendering for constructing the undersea cable. And by the way, that undersea cable on a per meter basis is one of the cheapest cables that's been built in Africa, so there was no corruption in that tendering process. And then the government, having essentially de-risked the entire project, they came to the private sector and said, look, we put in about $15 million into this. The total project cost is $100 million for our bit of this cable. Can you, the private sector, finance that, because we haven't got deep pockets to do it ourselves, and by the way, we don't want to run it ourselves. We want you guys to run it. Set up a company called Teams, have a board of directors, but you have to finance it. Well, by that stage, it was a no-brainer for the operators. The entire thing had been de-risked. All they had to do was take this bit of paper, go to their board and say, we need $10 million to be part of this cable, and if you give us the check in 5 installments over the next 6 months, within 12 months the cable will be built. And so government facilitated fixing a market failure. That was a great project. The World Bank has been doing some great projects where they were very cognizant of not going out and disrupting the private sector's initiatives, and so they went out and put out tenders not to build network, but to deliver capacity into various places in the region, Rwanda, Uganda, some other countries, Zambia, I think, Malawi. And what they did was they said, here's a tender to deliver this much capacity into this place for the next 10 years. But we will pay you up front for delivering that capacity, which meant that the operators who in open tenders bid for those contracts were able to use that upfront cash to build network into places where otherwise they couldn't have economically justified it. But having built the infrastructure, that infrastructure was owned by a private sector company. And by the way, they did multiple tenders, so the guys who won the first time round weren't allowed to bid the second time round. Somebody else got it the second time round. And it's, in my view, been a very, very successful project. So those two forms of government intervention really work. Some others where national backbones get built, and NOFB for the Kenyans here is sort of national disaster. They just don't work.
There was a question here from the lady, yes?
C'est encore Séraphine Boguy de la Côte d'Ivoire. Je suis passionnée par tout ce qui est contenu et j'aimerais encore appuyer pour dire que l'Afrique a du contenu. Tout à l'heure, il y a celle du Kenya qui intervenait, qui disait que l'État a dû prendre des décisions pour pouvoir amener tout ce qui est contenu qui partait à l'extérieur. Je pense que notre contenu, il y a du contenu, mais les contenus sont ailleurs. Donc, c'est aussi une volonté politique. Chez nous, ça marche un peu comme ça, une volonté politique pour que les contenus soient ici, nos contenus soient ici, pour que la majeure partie de nos contenus reviennent ici, pour que nous puissions vraiment profiter. Donc, c'est aussi pour attirer l'attention de tout un chacun, pour dire que c'est vrai, il y a du contenu, mais comment faire pour pouvoir regrouper tout ce contenu-là? Merci.
Yeah, the content challenge is a really difficult one. In Kenya, the regulator came out with a rule last year, and they said 60% of content on local broadcasters had to be local content. Now, that might seem like a good idea, but actually it creates a whole series of perverse incentives, where instead of lifting the bar on local content production and making content which can be exported around the world, or first exported in the region, then exported across the continent, and then exported to the world, actually it becomes self-defeating because that broadcaster has a certain budget. He has a certain revenue, he has a certain budget for content, and if suddenly he's told, you've now got to stop buying... So here's a number for you. It costs about, give or take, $1,000 an hour to buy international content. If I want to go out and buy a telenovela, it'll cost me between $800 and $1,000 an hour. To produce that content will, depending on the quality, cost between $15,000 and $20,000 an hour. So that's not going to work for the broadcaster, is it? Because his revenue hasn't changed. He can't suddenly multiply his content costs by 20 and think he's going to continue to make money. And so that the end result is that the broadcaster says, well, you know, if that's what I've got to do, that's what I've got to do, and he just produces garbage to fill up a whole bunch of hours of content in off-peak hours, so he can meet the regulations that have come in. And if he's lucky, he's sufficiently connected that he's the one who never gets enforced. The other guys are the ones who gets enforced, and it creates all sorts of friction in the market. So one has to be really careful about how one does this local content quoting. It's really very tricky.
Thanks, and I think one final question from my side, with Mitriki's permission. Okay.
Ok. Merci. Je me nomme. Prenez vos micros. Je me nomme Awa Diakité du Mali. Et ici, j'ai 2 casquettes en tant que membre de Internet Society Mali et aussi de l'Agence des technologies de l'information et de la communication. Donc le sujet est très passionnant. Mais à l'issue de tout ce qui s'est dit par rapport à cette question de gouvernement, de contenu, de l'infrastructure, moi je pense que le plus difficile, c'est de rassurer les gouvernements quels sont les avantages qu'ils gagnent, qu'ils vont tirer pour la mise en place. Parce que toute cette difficulté, c'est dû au fait que les gouvernements, c'est-à-dire les décideurs au niveau politique, n'ont pas bien saisi les enjeux. Qu'est-ce qu'ils gagnent? C'est tout facile pour un gouvernement de laisser le secteur privé émerger sur le secteur et avoir des gains en termes d'emploi, en termes de développement du secteur. Mais si le gouvernement ne sait pas qu'il a de tels bénéfices, il va se mettre à faire pensant que lui-même il va faire ses bénéfices. Alors que quand c'est dans la main du gouvernement, c'est pas évident que les objectifs visés ne seront pas retenus. Donc le plus gros de notre boulot ici, c'est vraiment faire, dans quelle mesure, rassurer les gouvernements qu'ils ont tout à gagner quand ils mettent en place des infrastructures par le privé ou bien les acteurs concernés, un truc commun et qui gagnent leur part sur le marché. C'est juste une question de les rassurer. Sinon, tout le monde veut bien gagner, mais quand ils ne savent pas comment le faire, ils s'accaparent de tout et finalement, rien ne gagne. Je vous remercie. Ça, c'était une contribution.
You know, I've spent 20 years banging my head against the wall with government policies. And in 95, when we started, we didn't know from one day to the next whether we'd be making money or in prison. When we started the Kenyan Internet Exchange in 2000, the government actually closed it down, and it took 18 months of lambasting them in the media to get it opened up again. I have to tell you that it's changed. In Kenya particularly, and I know in Uganda, and I know in Rwanda, government gets it. And they really do get it, and they've started doing some very good initiatives, and the stuff that they're doing towards getting government content online, the stuff they're doing with educational networks, is really beginning to make a difference. I could not survive without my mobile phone anymore. Right, my bank account, my M-Pesa, my paying my taxes, my paying for my parking. When I leave my phone at home, I send my driver to the house to get it and pick it up and bring it to me, because I can't do without it. And it's all because all these services are going online. And so I think where there's less enlightened government, and as I say, I'm very impressed with what the Kenyan government particularly has been doing, but also in Rwanda and Uganda. So where there are less enlightened administrations, I think peer pressure is the answer. I've always found that peer pressure is the way to go. and bringing those people to areas where it works. The seeing is believing, and you know, if there's anything we can do to host people in Kenya, I know Meole is part of the system. He's always happy to assist and bring people out to see what's happening in Kenya.
All right. So just to close it off from my side, just one question, one final question, is around hubs. So around the world, there are key hubs, key traffic concentration hubs. You know, Singapore in Southeast Asia, Hong Kong, maybe Tokyo in the northern side, Los Angeles in the Pacific West, New York in the east, London in Europe, and so forth. Any part of the Middle East that might make sense, maybe Fujairah, so forth. So for Africa, particularly on the east and southern coast of Africa, South Africa is too far, so I don't see that being a hub. That would leave, obviously, on the east side, would probably leave East Africa, which leaves Mombasa. Dar es Salaam is, not a lot of cables are coming in. There's a lot more cables coming to Mombasa. Obviously, you have the AE1 cable, CME 5, GBI. You have the one from Perth to Djibouti, all going to Djibouti. So that brings Djibouti into play. Seeing the market in Djibouti today as we know it, is the race on? Is it Djibouti? Is it Mombasa?
I think it's horses for courses. You know, people tend to try to find the magic bullet for Africa. We all know that's a nonsense. Africa is at least 3, possibly 4 different continents in one, infrastructure regions. For sure, Kenya is going to be a hub for East Africa. Djibouti, the problem with Djibouti is Ethiopia. Because Ethiopia is closed for telecoms, I think it's the only country in the world today which still has a monopoly telco. So Ethiopia is very closed, and that's going to inhibit Djibouti. Now, that doesn't mean Djibouti doesn't have a role to play. They're a transit point for all the cables going from Europe to the Far East, and there's constantly new, bigger, better cables being built. So I think Djibouti has a role. I think Kenya has a role, and the sort of constant debate around regional hubs. Regional hubs are good for everybody else as well as that hub, right? If Kenya becomes a regional hub, then Uganda and Rwanda really benefit. And you know, in East Africa, the big disappointment is Tanzania. It's a phenomenally fast-growing economy. It could be a gateway to the entire region, and unfortunately, they've just pursued a policy approach which is, you know, we've now got we lost the Berlin Wall. We now have the East Africa virtual wall across Tanzania, which is separating East Africa from Southern Africa, and it's very sad. Hopefully, after the elections, things will change.
Mr. Stuckey, I think it will be the final one over there.
Thank you, Mr. Tinker. I'm afraid I have to take exception with your remark that South Africa's too far away.
I figured you would come up with that. That was initially for you.
Thank you. If South Africa's actually the closest because it's in the middle between the East Coast and the West Coast cables. So it's the shortest path to it. Cheers.
Okay, Ben, we really do need to go.
Yeah,
okay.
I'll just add to that. You know, there is a lot of African data in South Africa. A lot of popular banking, you know, websites, and a lot of banks, Pan-African banks, Pan-African businesses. So South Africa is very much a data hub and a connectivity hub for all of East Africa, where there's a lot of trade synergies. Yeah.
And 1 million COSAR domains registered.
They keep on rolling. There's Martin.
Martin Levy from Cloudflare. I'd like to point out, without picking on any country, the reason why the various hubs that you mentioned at the beginning of this question came into existence was not because somebody said, I think this should be where we put everything. It was because the data center providers, the internet exchange operators, made an environment that caused interconnection and the placement of content to exist within inside those locations. It wasn't an edict from governments, even though as a side note, the Singapore government has put quite a bit of money into its IDA to help and improve things there. They actually were late to the game. It was already happening. So, to recall from my history why some of those sites became extremely popular to host content, to interconnect networks, and to become the powerhouses that they are today, it was because those elements were, quite frankly, very cost effective and delivered efficiently and reliably. So, cost effective. People providing interconnects, a fiber patch cable between two providers, were able to deliver within days versus weeks. Were able to deliver for a handful of dollars, a few hundred, versus $20, $30, $40, $50,000 for a piece of fiber 100 feet long. Sorry, 33 meters. When it came to the internet exchanges, nearly every one of the locations that you mentioned has some form of internet members organization or simply a very effective commercial provider that has given the networks the ability to interconnect. And while I have great respect for those people in the audience here that are coming from regulatory or government environments, nearly every single one of those locations you mentioned are locations where the least amount of regulation occurred and therefore naturally became very well serviced locations. There is, I think, probably somebody who has written a wonderful deep paper on this somewhere on the internet, but I'm just giving you my history from bolting boxes into racks in various places around the world over the last umpteen years. Hope that helps.
Thank you, Martin. Any final words? Richard?
No, I think the point that Martin makes is really, really important. Less regulation is better, and so even if there are things where one thinks, oh well, maybe we need some regulation to force this to happen. Actually, if it should happen, it will happen. The private sector, investors and entrepreneurs will make it happen, and the less that government interferes, the better.
You've been a good guest. Thank you very much.